examines the selection of the 2020 presidential candidate in light of the 2016 election. It's timely, to be sure. Just a couple notes if you missed those screen messages. Please keep your audio muted so we can best hear our speakers, and we encourage you to use speaker view so that the speaker takes up more of your real estate on your screen. It will make it a little bit easier for everyone to understand. Now, just a note on the structure. We're going to, after a few introductory remarks from me, we're going to hear from 4 of the most esteemed political scientists and political commentators in the country. I'm going to give brief introductions of all 4 of them so that you're not constantly being interrupted by my introduction. So I will introduce them in the order in which they're speaking, which is alphabetical. Each of them will have an opportunity after their brief remarks to pose a question to Seth if they'd like, and then we'll give Seth Masket a few minutes to respond. All of this time is time, of course, that you can submit questions to us through the chat feature. It would be easiest if you submitted them to me, Susan Schulten, but you're also welcome to select individuals who are our panelists if you'd like to direct questions to them. We will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So I hope that all makes sense, and with that, on with the show. Our 4 panelists, like I said, are 4 of the most illustrious, esteemed, accomplished political commentators working today. First, I'd like to introduce you to Julia Azari, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, and also serves as the Director of Graduate Studies, both for Political Science and International Affairs at Marquette. Julia earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois and completed her graduate work at Yale. She contributes to multiple blogs and media outlets and is the author of Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate with Cornell, 2014. After Julia's remarks, we'll turn to Molly Ball, who has been the national political correspondent for Time magazine since 2017. Molly graduated from Yale University in 2001, and her career has included stints at The Atlantic, Politico, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and the Las Vegas Sun. Her work has been honored with 5 prizes and awards for distinguished reporting, and she is also the author of a new biography of Nancy Pelosi, published by Henry Holt just this year. Finally, I think our audience will be especially interested to know that Molly is the daughter of 2 beloved professors here at DU who have recently retired, mathematician Rick Ball and Professor of Management Joan Wynn. After Molly, we'll hear from Jonathan Bernstein, who is a Bloomberg opinion columnist covering politics and policy, and one of the most prolific writers I have ever come across. Before joining Bloomberg, Jonathan was a writer for the American Prospect, as well as the New Republic, and he maintained several blogs about politics. Jonathan has also done his time on campus, having taught political science at the University of Texas, San Antonio, as well as DePauw University. His most recent book is The Making of the Presidential Candidates 2020, co-authored with Casey B.D. Dominguez, self-described as, quote, a political junkie's guide to the 2020 presidential race, unquote. After Jonathan, we'll hear from Hans Noel, who is Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University, where he researches political coalitions, parties, and ideology. Before teaching at Georgetown, Hans was a fellow at the University of Michigan, as well as Princeton University. He earned his undergraduate degree at Northwestern and his doctorate at UCLA, where I am guessing he met Seth Masket. He is also the author of Political Ideologies and Political Parties in America with Cambridge University Press, and a co-author before that of The Party Decides, Presidential Nominations Before and After Reform. And if that wasn't enough of a vita for you, Hans has also made an award-winning feature film entitled The Rest of Your Life. And then finally, of course, we'll hear from our colleague and friend, Seth Masket, our guest of honor. Seth is Professor of Political Science and the founder, as well as the director of the Center on American Politics here at DU. He is the author of The Inevitable Party, Why Attempts to Kill the Party System Fail and How They Weaken Democracy. And before that, No Middle Ground, How Informal Party Organizations Control Nominations and Polarize Legislatures. Seth contributes to Mischiefs of Faction and 538, and his work has appeared in Politico, the New York Times, the LA Times, and Monkey Cage at the Washington Post. Seth earned his undergraduate degree at the University of California and his graduate degree at UCLA. All right, Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to the first of our commentators, Julia Azari. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's great to be here discussing this really fascinating book that Seth has written, and seeing it come to fruition after many years of conversations about the research that he's put into this and the crafting of the narrative, much of which occurred during the 2020 primary this spring, with all of us not quite knowing how it was going to turn out. So I just want to address a bit the kind of introductory premise of the book, this idea of how party activists, how they interpret elections. So for a long time, political scientists really rejected the idea of election mandates or thinking about messages carried by certain elections, because the concept itself is so implausible. It's impossible to know exactly what people meant. It's impossible to aggregate those preferences in a meaningful way. So for a long time, the political science perspective was that elections install legitimate leaders, at least that's the hope. And beyond that, everything is fuzzy. But journalists and regular citizens continue to be drawn to the concept. And against the advice of our colleagues over earlier decades, a handful of us have spent time trying to understand the implications of stories that we tell about elections. This book, Learning from Loss, advances this literature and makes a contribution on what we know about election interpretation in two really important ways. One is by flipping the script and looking at loss rather than victory, and contributing to a small body of scholarship that approaches election results that way. And also by talking to party activists and using these narratives about the election to understand subsequent decisions. So this is a huge contribution to a literature that I might be a little bit biased, but that I think is important and has long been overlooked in political science. Building on that, I just have a few reactions to that part of the book that I want to share. And one is about these conversations with party activists about the specific kinds of explanations that they came up with for 2016. And I couldn't help but think about whether these explanations are driven by the kinds of conclusions that these activists had already reached. Did they, for example, gravitate toward elections based on things that they felt they could control? And the book goes into a bit these sort of implications about what kinds of election interpretations would lead parties to do things differently, and what would suggest that factors beyond their control were really what was at work, what was behind, in this case, the surprising 2016 loss. I also wonder if we have a tendency, and if party activists have a tendency to be drawn to narratives that advantage the already advantaged, that bring an advantage to people who already have power. And this has concerned me throughout in the identity politics explanation that so many of these activists advanced, is this question about whether we're drawn to that explanation because it kind of keeps power where we're used to it being, with white men. And even for people who may object to that state of affairs, might, still kind of be comforted by it on some subconscious level. And I wonder how that's shaping people's conclusions. Finally, I've been thinking a lot about this observation in political psychology that tells us that fear makes people risk averse. And I wonder the degree to which activists had kind of already decided that they were going to gravitate toward a risk-averse choice and came up with explanations that would help justify that choice. Finally, I just want to briefly touch on party and partisan politics. In the struggle to win a general election, especially a presidential election, Democrats have to respond now to an environment in which Republicans have mobilized cultural conflict on race, immigration, and so they have to kind of play that front with the national electorate, but internally they're trying to manage a very diverse coalition, diverse ideologically, diverse demographically. And so I wonder how these two forces work together. So these are my comments and questions, and now I'm going to attend to my deeply disgruntled cat.
I was wondering whose cat that was. Thank you, Julia. Seth, would you like to address those, or would you like to think about them while Molly makes some comments?
Yeah, why don't I'll jump in and just respond to what Julia had to say on that. And first of all, if it's okay for me to just say briefly about Julia, she's probably the person I've talked to longest about this project from when I was first thinking about it. I've known Julia for a decade. She's seriously one of the most thoughtful party scholars out there. When I asked her to participate in this thing today, after she's participated in so many other things related to this book, I think she said something like, you should really get more friends. I really appreciate her doing this. And I think I mentioned in the book that she's someone who steals all my best ideas a year or two before I think of them. And I continue to mean them. So I thank her for engaging with this book. On this question of, there was one question she asked I really wanted to touch on because I've been struggling with it too. Basically, the idea of whether these were narratives that these activists were already inclined to believe, and they were just kind of looking for confirmatory evidence to believe what they already believed, or were they going into, or were they coming out of this election really with a kind of a clean slate and not sure what had happened? And at least from the interviews, I really got the impression that both were happening. They just happened for different sorts of people. And I don't yet have a typology of which types of people fall into which category. There were, one woman I spoke to in New Hampshire who really kind of, made an impact on me when I spoke to her fairly early in 2017. She had mentioned that she was this lifelong feminist. She had backed Hillary Clinton both in 07, 08 and 15, 16. And that the 2016 election had just completely changed what she thought. And she was suddenly thinking, wow, we really need to nominate a white guy for the next time. And then I followed up with her a year or two later, and she had changed her mind again. She said, the results of 2018 changed who I thought could win, and so I'm open to new evidence. So there were people like that. But also, as Julia points out, like the sort of identity politics narrative, the idea that Democrats need to pull back from their commitment to diversity in order to win once in a while. That's a really old argument that goes back at least to the 1960s. And there's some chunk of the party that is really ready to believe that no matter what happened in the election. So that's something I want to think about more going forward. Like, whether are we talking about people who are have more or less history in the party? Is it about their own identity or what? But anyway, really good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth and Julia. We're now going to turn to Molly Ball, who does this for a living. So go ahead, Molly.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Seth, for having me. So as the reporter on the panel, I thought I would evaluate the book, look at it from a journalist perspective. My conclusions will, of course, reflect my biases. Spoiler, I will conclude that the media was mostly right, except in those instances where I disagreed with what the rest of the media was doing, in which case I will critique the media. But one of the things I really liked about this book was that Seth did sort of approach this question like a reporter, right? Figuring out the key players in a story, being on the ground, conducting interviews. I love political scientists, and even if I didn't, I certainly would not insult them in this forum. But it's always been our view as reporters that you can sort of sit in your ivory tower running regression analyses all day long, and there's no substitute for actually getting to know the people making the decisions and seeing the process up close. A lot of sophisticated reporters, such as myself, like to tell ourselves that we take the sort of traditional journalism and try to infuse it with some of the insights and techniques of political science. So it seemed to me like Seth was sort of doing the same thing from the other side of that divide, and I really appreciated that. So I think it is interesting also that the book comes to a lot of the same conclusions that I think we in the media did in the course of covering this 2020 primary campaign. Starting with this idea that it was a wide open field with no real front runner, that Biden might have nominally been the front runner in terms of his polling position and his credentials and endorsements, but he was much weaker than a typical front runner and didn't have the overwhelming party backing or the unanimous support of big donors. And this played out in the widespread indecision that you heard from the activists on the ground, in the late breaking nature of the contest, the sort of ambivalence that you could see in the polls throughout. We also, I think, covering the campaign, concluded that that learning from loss, for lack of a better word, was really driving a lot of the decisions that Democrats were making or were trying to make about who should be their nominee. This was a constant refrain that you heard from activists and partisans on the ground, that all of their decisions were being filtered through this prism of the trauma that they felt from 2016 and the sort of desperation that they felt to find a candidate who could beat Trump. Obviously, parties always want to win, but there was an acuteness, there was an edge to it that came from that 2016 experience. And also, but at the same time, there was a lot of disagreement about what 2016 meant, right? Everybody wanted to figure out how to not do what had been done in 2016, but nobody could really agree on what the problem was. And Seth does a very good job, I think, of parsing all the different strands of that, the different explanations. And one of the things that he highlights that I thought was interesting was the media's failure to coalesce around a single explanation, which both reflected and contributed to participants in the process not being able to coalesce around a single explanation. And that added to this indecision throughout the process. So there was also, you heard all the candidates, making electability arguments, trying to cater to this. And it was interesting to me that it was sort of a narrative in search of a candidate, right? That people would be very upfront with you that they were afraid, that they wanted something safe, that they wanted someone, electable. They might even tell you that they wanted a white man because they saw that as a safer choice, but they weren't sure which one. And there was this enormous field to choose from. And so it's sort of the opposite of the typical process where people will fall in love with a candidate and then they'll sort of retrofit their argument to fit that candidate. They'll sort of convince themselves that Elizabeth Warren is the electable one because she's the candidate they like. In this case, it was sort of the opposite, right? They knew they wanted a certain type of candidate and they just weren't sure which of the choices best fit that mold. But there are obviously a lot of things that we pay attention to in political journalism that the book spends relatively little time on. And that's understandable. I mean, it's not meant to be an exhaustive look at all the factors that determined the 2020 Democratic primary. It is specifically about this question of learning from loss and election narratives, but I thought I'd highlight a few of those. Campaign tactics. Did so-and-so have a ground game? Who was spending the most money on TV ads? Where were the candidates traveling? And which, in which ways were they trying to add certain pieces to their coalition and so on, how they attacked each other. In retrospect, I think there was relatively little coverage of that this time around, maybe because we sort of sensed that was maybe not as big a factor as in the past. And in retrospect, it does seem like the only tactic that any candidate really needed was a Jim Clyburn outreach strategy. But another thing that shows up relatively little in this book is the actual performance of the candidates, right? This often gets derided as theater criticism, but it's the way voters really do evaluate candidates, right? Especially in these early primary states where they put very high premium on interacting with the candidates, seeing them up close. And that was a huge factor in, the rise of someone like Pete Buttigieg, who impressed a lot of people just with the way that he could speak and perform on a debate stage and so on. And also, I think, depressed Biden's vote for a long time and kept him from becoming a more decisive frontrunner because people, especially in Iowa, were concerned about his ability to perform and to get on that stage and to be consistent. There's not much about the horse race in this book. There's a sort of section where he sort of distastefully deals with it. But we obviously write about the horse race, about polls a lot. And I think this kind of coverage gets a bad rap. Honestly, we're trying to evaluate public opinion, and polls are a much more scientific way to get at that than interviewing 10-party activists. But in retrospect, the polls were accurate that there was a consistent sort of plurality front runner, but that people were really looking for a safe choice and weren't finding it until very late in the process. There's not a lot about events that actually happened in the campaign, right? Turning points in the narrative, and media coverage itself. And I think that that's actually, that was a big factor. You know, we heard so much in 2016 about how it was the media's fault that we got Trump, or it was the media's fault that Hillary won and Bernie lost the primary. There was relatively little of that this time around, but it seemed to me that, you know, just the fact that this primary was not covered all that much compared to a typical competitive presidential primary, because Trump was eating up so much of the news hole and so much of the oxygen and so much of sort of the outrage space, that people just sort of didn't have bandwidth for it. So I do wonder whether this process would have turned out differently with more just sort of focus on the process. And the other thing is, there, you know, there's this chapter on factionalism that I think is really interesting, but it doesn't say much about the size of the respective factions, right? One thing that I've been beating a drum about for a long time is the sort of asymmetry within the parties, where, you know, the overwhelming majority of Republicans consider themselves conservative, but the majority of Democrats do not consider themselves liberal. That's starting to change, and we're now seeing progressive anti-establishment candidates win, particularly some House primaries this cycle. So I do wonder whether this idea of sort of a rising activist left, the idea that this faction of the party is growing in size, how that played into this primary process. But the general takeaway from the book, you know, that I saw this so much in my reporting, was that the party wanted to decide, people wanted the party to decide, but the party just sort of couldn't and didn't want to be seen as deciding. So there was this sort of circularity to the process, where everybody was looking for a signal, looking for a leader to follow, but the leaders were looking to their followers to lead, and the followers looking to the leaders, and so it contributed to this sort of murk of indecision. I think probably also disempowered some of the less well-known candidates that were trying to put themselves on people's radar, whether a Buttigieg or a Bennett or whoever else. But then the other sort of conclusion of the book, or maybe even premise of the book, that the process was really inseparable from the moment, that this election was such a process, a product of what happened in 2016, that was disproportionately important to this primary process. And so that poses a lot of questions about what this process may be like the next time we go through this, and what a potential Biden presidency would be like, right? So I'm interested in hearing Seth's thoughts based on this research and based on these conversations about, you know, whether a potential President Biden would face greater pressure from the left, greater policy pressure than President Obama, and then also what Democrats will learn or will have learned if Biden loses this election.
Thank you, Molly. There is so much embedded in that. Wow, there's just a lot of really, really great questions about how Seth conceptualized the book and organized it. Seth, would you like to respond to some of those?
Yeah, sure. I can't get to everything, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. As I did with Julia, I want to mention just a little bit about Molly, and I really appreciate her doing this event. About 4 years ago, I was at a conference in Chicago with, well, a number of the people who were here. Hans and Jennifer Victor and Corinne McConaughey were late to this conference due to a snowstorm. A bunch of us had tickets to Hamilton. Molly happened to be there covering this conference, and so we offered her one of the tickets, which she took. And even though she said she's not big on musicals, I think she thought Hamilton was fine. So we appreciated her doing that. I have really enjoyed talking with her over the years, and particularly about this project. And I agree with her characterization here, in that in some ways I was sort of taking on the role of reporter for some of this book. There's some risk there. It's not my field. And I do like doing that aspect. And I, you know, to the extent I'm trained in it, I, you know, shout out to the Daily Californian and the Calabasas Courier for giving me some of that training earlier in my life, but I'm operating a bit out of my lane here. I'm kind of playing in Molly's sandbox, and I appreciate her for not pushing me back too far for getting it wrong. But that was the part of the book I really loved the most, was doing that research. There were a couple of things she pointed out in in her comments is just, interestingly, just thinking about the overall stability of this race. That is, there was a lot going on during this primary contest. And we can talk a little bit about like the characteristics of the candidates and Joe Biden's skills or lack thereof relative to other candidates. But what was really notable, if you look at the polling in that race, is just how stable it was. That once Joe Biden's name was out there, he emerged as the front runner and didn't really change very much throughout all of 2019. You look for sort of turning points, like the one sort of the biggest highlight of 2019 for me was that the first candidate debate, when Kamala Harris really hit Biden very hard on his earlier comments that he had worked well in the Senate with some segregationists, and that showed what a get-along guy he was. And she pointed out how hurtful it was and how his stances on busing were really wrong. And briefly, that hurt him in the polls. He lost like 5 points there, and she gained. And then within a few weeks, that effect was over, and the race kind of returned to its familiar pattern. So, like, maybe things would have been different if there had been more such attacks. Maybe things would have been different if this had received the same sort of attention that previous cycles have. But I was really, kind of struck by the fact that there was the sense that Biden or someone like him was really going to be the choice. And unless he really screwed up too badly, he wasn't going to lose that favorability. She also pointed out, I can get into sort of size of the factions later, but I did want to get to that one other question of Molly's about basically what would a President Biden be like? And this has been really interesting to watch. I think one of the skills of Biden's that we didn't necessarily see during the primaries and caucuses, but has really come to the fore since his winning the nomination, is how coalition oriented he is. He's someone, if you look back on his career, like basically a 50-year career in Democratic politics, he's someone who's been relentlessly at the middle of the Democratic Party ideologically. He has this ability to kind of read the Democratic room and just position himself where he needs to position himself. And if you look, basically one of the first things he did after clinching the nomination was to reach out to the Sanders team and start talking about a governing agenda and a campaigning agenda and embracing some of what they were doing, and figuring out areas where they could work together without ever really saying any of the bombastic, the sort of lightning rod statements like Medicare for all or abolish ICE or anything like that. Still pretty substantially moving to the left, recognizing that, okay, this is where most of the party is right now. And here's how far I can move while still winning this thing. I think we'd see more of that in a Biden presidency. One of the things that people have been talking about just in the last week in response to this open Supreme Court seat is, what will Democrats do to respond? Would they grant statehood to DC and Puerto Rico? Would they try to expand the Supreme Court by 2 or 3 seats? My instinct, looking back on Biden's career, is that he's not a very radical person. He's a 30+ year Senate incumbent. He's a real institutionalist. He's not likely to seek radical changes there. On the other hand, if a big chunk of his party is pushing him in that way, he might be open to that. I don't see him necessarily being willing to go to war with the most vocal aspect of his party to stop that from happening. So I don't know. That'll be the interesting thing to see. I think the Sanders and AOC and others on the left within his party, I think largely see someone as Biden, they can tolerate and can do business with. And they plan on pushing him and pulling him a lot, assuming he gets into office. And I think he'd be open to that.
Thank you, Seth. Just as a reminder, if you'd like to submit a question for the panel, go ahead and use the chat, and you can single me out as the recipient, and I will pass those along. We're going to continue with another veteran journalist. Jonathan, give us your thoughts.
Well, I won't take the name journalist, but I guess that's what I do. First of all, I just want to say, Seth, it's a terrific achievement. It's the way that it builds on the party network research that that you've been doing for years, and that some of us have been doing, and Hans has been doing for years, and sort of taking that research and then making it actually come alive in this particular example, instead of sort of being defensive about party network research, which is mostly what I do. You know, I think it's just terrific, and you know, all that, and then put on top of it that it's published now. You know, wow. So, you know, it's a terrific achievement. I want to defend it as someone who, you know, my full-time job is a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, but I also have a foot still more or less in political science. And not to criticize Molly, but I want to defend what Seth did as, you know, very straightforward political science. And I don't know if you can see the Richard Fenno books that I have behind me here, but, you know, the poking and prodding and the talking to individuals is very much a political science thing, and it's different, I think, than what I'm not a reporter. I write columns. I don't report at all, other than I report to Twitter about lawn signs in my neighborhood. I feel like that's a contribution I can make. You know, it's not really the same as, from what I understand, what reporters do. And I think that Seth did a terrific job of, you know, going through and it's just a different type of interview, I think, and it's a different type of seeking information, but it's very much part of social science. And, you know, we shouldn't think of political scientists as people who only sit back in the ivory tower and run regressions. This is hardcore political science just the same. So I do want to sort of defend the profession, I guess, a little bit, or just point that out anyway. On the substance, I want to think a little bit about one of the things that sort of interested me, is that Seth calls all of his the people he talks to activists. And one of the things that I've found and that I haven't really been able to understand very well is the different components that make up parties. So that he talks to campaign professionals, he talks to people who I think of as sort of party-aligned interest group leaders. He talks to donors, or he gets data from donors. He talks to long-term people who I would just call sort of activists, the people who volunteer their time and get involved in things, some of which may be attached to a formal party. You know, some of them may have been, and I'm not sure if, I didn't take careful notes on this, if there were some formal party officials and some formal party staff. It seems to me that one of the things that's gone wrong with the Republican Party, which is, I think, a large part of this book, which he sort of hints at but doesn't really talk about, is that in the Republican Party, there's some real incentive problems and some real dysfunction in terms of party-aligned media, Fox News and the talk shows and all that, having much too strong a influence over the rest of the party. They're the ones who have the least incentive to win elections. And we don't really see anybody in this book that is indifferent to winning an election or that has mixed incentives like that. And so that's interesting to me. I don't think that you would have had the same thing if you were dealing with the Republican Party. I think you would have had to run into those people a lot more. And as we think about what went wrong for the Republicans, if we think that's what it is, and I think it's correct, in 2016 versus what went right for the Democrats in both 2016 and 2020, the absence of that is a huge factor. The absence of those people who may very well do better if their party loses. Another topic, you know, this is very much a book about the nomination process as candidate selection. And it really is, and that's sort of the normal way we think of it. But there's another way to think of the nomination process, which is as the way the party defines itself, both in terms of policy and policy priorities and agenda, and in terms of all the other ways. And so when we talk about sort of the identity questions that Seth talks about a lot, you define yourself as a party through your nomination process. And so that gets into this question of what the Democratic platform is going to look like, and it gets into what a Biden presidency is going to look like. And it was sort of surprising to me, I think, that what Seth just answered in terms of the question of what a Biden presidency would look like and why the platform worked out the way it did. And in that, I think, Seth, you gave just now a very much a Biden-centric answer to it. And I wonder if that's right. I would probably think that what you're finding in the book is much more of a party-centric answer to what both of those things would be. That the reason that Biden becomes the nominee is because he is obviously good at working with these different parts of the party, and he's good at he's able to reconcile those things, and that where he's going to go is where the party is. And I think that you would say that if, say, Bernie Sanders was better at that kind of thing, you could very much imagine Bernie Sanders having won the nomination if he ran a less factional campaign and a more coalition-style campaign. He could have won the nomination and wound up running a very similar presidency to Joe Biden. And you can imagine, Elizabeth Warren in the same, I don't think she lost because she's bad at coalition building, but I think that Seth gets much more to I think that Seth's narratives are much more an answer to that. But, that again, I think Warren and some of the stuff that I got wrong, of course, the nomination, I look at Warren, I say that's where Democrats are. And I think that's actually where the party is. It's where the presidency would be. It's not as far, it's not socialism, it's not Bernie's party. It's very much Warren's party, I think, in terms of policy and agenda. And so I think that's sort of, I guess I'd ask Seth a little bit to talk about that more in terms of how the process puts the constraints on more than just because Biden happens to be a guy who can do that. The other quick one I've got is, you get to October, November, and you have all these uncertainties, and they're very, these people who really want an electable candidate, and you don't know who the electable candidate is. And it seems to me that there's some of this in the book, and I think you're hinting that there's even more of it, saying, okay, we're going to let the primaries give us the information that we need. We don't know who's electable. Primaries are good at that. We get the voters involved. So if that's right, however, then they run into this immediate problem of Iowa, New Hampshire. And what I'm wondering, and I don't think I saw this at all in the book, is how did they explicitly talk about primaries as information about electability? And if so, did they talk about the Iowa, New Hampshire problem, the demographics of Iowa, New Hampshire, and how they would discount that or how they would deal with the whole thing? So, I'm very interested also in the interaction between what parties do and contingency. I think that the whole nomination basically came down to who was going to finish second in Nevada. I think Joe Biden won it by finishing second in Nevada, sorry. And, he didn't have to do that, I don't think. But, would they have interpreted Iowa differently if Mayor Pete had won solidly on election night? Would they have interpreted Iowa, New Hampshire differently if Bernie had won solidly in Iowa? Would they have said, okay, we'll deal with Mayor Pete if he had finished second in Nevada, or if Amy Klobuchar had? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So I'll stop there.
Seth, would you like to respond briefly? Because I know folks are anxious to hear from Hans.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Those are great questions. Just briefly, I was going to say our discipline suffered a real loss when Jonathan Bernstein left, except he's kind of doing it better now. Like in his writing for Bloomberg, he basically has a column out there every day, just applying political science to what's going on in the real world and explaining things in a very nice way. So I'm really loving the work he's doing. I encourage you all to read his column. So just to briefly touch on some of the things he mentioned, I agree and disagree in part with Jonathan, with what you said about why Biden was picked and what he would be like as president. My impression is that he was picked for one quality, and that was his perceived electability. Rightly or wrongly, this is what people in the party were really fixated on prior to this February. He has some other qualities that have turned out to be very important. One of them, it turns out, he's really good at empathy. And we saw that on display in some campaign moments last year. I would not have thought that was a very important campaign skill, because I would not have predicted a pandemic or him running against someone who is apparently incapable of empathy. But that's actually been a nice skill for him to highlight in the general election. I think one of his other big skills is basically thinking like a party, that is, thinking like part of someone in a coalition. And that is a skill that I think a party really wants in a nominee, but I don't think it was necessarily what it was highlighting when it was going through this process of making that choice. But yes, the fact that party constraints work on him, and that he will deliver something like a Democratic agenda once in office is a plus. But I think the party would have accepted less if they thought they could get a win out of it. And that's also, it's really interesting to think about the signal of Iowa and New Hampshire, where Biden came in, I think, like 4th and 5th, respectively, and what to make of that. I think in many ways, a lot of the conversation about the early contests was almost like Iowa and New Hampshire had been pre-discounted. There was a lot of discussion throughout 2019 about the vast demographic diversity of the presidential field and the real lack of diversity of Iowa and New Hampshire's electorate, and this chance that Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina each could produce different winners, and then what signal is that sending to the party? So I think in some ways it, the party was already prepared to like look at the signal it sent, but not necessarily say there's only 2 or 3 tickets out of those states. Which I don't know what that means going forward. I don't know if Iowa and New Hampshire have the same sort of power they will. Maybe they just do on the Republican side. I'm not sure. But unfortunately, that was where my interviews sort of ended around there. And so there's actually a really interesting research hole that I didn't quite get to about, things, how people were changing their mind in the middle of February. But it's an interesting answer. I got to think about it.
Thank you, Seth. And that sets up a great couple of questions that I'm getting on the chat for when we have Q&A. Finally, we're going to hear from Hans. Take it away.
Great, thank you. So this is a fantastic book, and I really enjoy having been involved in reading it early on, being able to say things about it, which means I also have like tons of things that I'd love to talk about, and I want to get through them quickly. So I'm going to like skip over a couple things, and Seth, if we are ever allowed to go to conferences again, then we can talk about them at the Palmer House or whatever succeeds the Palmer House as a place that we're allowed to meet in Chicago. All right, so this is, I think, really an excellent book. And I remember when Seth first proposed the idea for the book, and I really, I was excited about it then. I thought it was really interesting. There was probably some twinge of, I'm not sure if it's jealousy or envy or maybe a little bit of both at the idea, because at that same moment, as I recall, at that same conference that we had that conversation, the authors of The Party Decides and I were talking about what we should do in response to what happened in 2016. So, I mean, for those who wouldn't know, I mean, The Party Decides is a book that I'm a co-author on, and that argues that party actors like those that Seth studies in this book have a lot of influence on presidential nominations. And yet they appeared not to in 2016 from the Republican side. And so we were having the same thoughts that Seth was having about, well, maybe they're, how are the Republicans going to react to this? Now, our approach was fortunately very different from Seth's in the sense that we're not on top of each other in projects. We're like thinking, well, we're going to wait a couple cycles and see what happens and then try to figure things out. And so what's great is that, well, now when we do that, we need to go back and like get a good account of what happened in 2020. We have it with this really great work. So this is incredibly useful and interesting, and a big contribution, I think, to a lot of conversations. In fact, I think what's nice about this book is that it's both a strong book academically, but also it's really a book that I think has a real strong popular appeal, and to sort of non-academics who are interested in these kinds of questions, it'll also, it's readable, it's easy to understand, and so forth. And I think that's particularly important given the main sort of, if there's a thesis here, the main central point is that what matters is what the party, however we want to think about it, thinks happened in 2016. Not what actually happened. That might be kind of like, correlated at some level, but that's not what matters. What do they think happened? What are the lessons that they decided to learn or found their way toward learning, even if they're wrong? And I think that's really important. I mean, for academics, this is sometimes tricky, but at least it's familiar. As Julia pointed out, there's literature in this area already. But the idea of a socially constructed world, or the some kind of information sets, or whatever, however you want to think about it, like we get that, even if we don't always kind of embrace it. But I think for a lot of voters and for politically engaged people, the idea that people are evaluating what happened and that they might be wrong, and that those evaluations still are going to matter, that's really important, and not something that I think a lot of people would get. And yet I think they get it, or will get it from this book, because it is so clear about what the argument is. So I have 3 broad questions, which I'm going to touch on, and without going too deep into them. And then, I don't think you need to necessarily address them all here, because we also have questions in the chat that we'd like to get to. But let me just raise them. The first question is it possible to get closer to a right answer? And would it matter, and would it help, right? So like we as social scientists spend a lot of time trying to parse, why do these voters vote the way that they do? And can we distinguish between, economic anxiety and, race, or actually, sexism, or whatever that is driving voters' behaviors? And what is that exactly? And, is there a rationalization here? And of course, ordinary voters sometimes don't, just like anybody else, fully understand why they're doing what they're doing. And we're trying to there's a big literature about trying to understand what happened in 2016, some of which jives pretty well with what the people you talk to say, and some of it which doesn't. And is there a value to trying to inject a more accurate story into what the party leaders are thinking, what a party in general are thinking? Is it worth the effort, and would it have made a better or different outcome? I don't know, but I think that's an interesting question, because of course we're very invested in trying to understand and get the right answer. What would that look like? With the understanding, of course, that there might not be an individual right answer, right? Probably, the 2016 election, like many elections, is razor thin, close margin, which means that almost any perturbation might have changed the outcome, right? So maybe there isn't one answer, but there's still a set of things that probably did matter, and then some set of things that probably didn't, and some of those things that probably didn't are also in the mix of the conversation. So maybe that's interesting, I think. The second question is what lesson could, so originally in the original draft idea of the book, you had we were going to study Republicans, because they were the ones who were going to have this comeuppance, and then they didn't. But the Republicans should have learned a lesson, or there was a lesson to be learned from a Republican race in 2016. And there's a question of whether the Democrats should have also paid attention to that, and maybe learned that lesson too, and tried to understand something about how the process should work, that that thing happened over on the Republican side, but it could also happen on the Democratic side. Or longer term, will anybody ever learn that lesson from what happened on the Republican side? And I'm particularly thinking I could go deep into what I think the lesson is, but I think a lot of it has to do with problems with the primary process, all the way from primaries are bad in general, that I might be willing to say, and McGovern-Fraser was bad, down to the more specifics, if you don't want to go all the way to there, but there's some problems with a multi-candidate race, and with the sequential nature, and the contingency that Jonathan was talking about. And it's possible that a different system with all the same learning from loss might have generated a Warren or a Harris or somebody else, right? That they might have said, well, okay, if we have more control, if we literally had a smoke-filled room at a convention, we could make a decision that we can't make given these institutions. And so the best that we can do is someone like Biden, who also has some broad appeal and whatever. And so thinking about what lesson we should be learning about the broader primary process, I think is worth engaging with. And then finally, I just want to raise a question about the factions, because I really find this part interesting. And one thing that I think is interesting that your work highlights here is that whatever factionalism there is, it's not so simple as an ideological liberals, progressives versus moderate centrists, right? That's part of it for sure. but it's really more about it's a more process and engagement and being, being sort of part of the system and working within the system and politics as usual versus, sort of upending everything kind of cleavage. That's a big part of it. And I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been reading Molly Ball's book on Pelosi, which I highly recommend. So everybody, you should all buy Seth's book because that's why we're here. But if you have any money left over, you should also buy Molly's book because I'm loving it. It is fantastic. At least, as far as I've gotten, and I'm sure that there's more insights beyond. But as far as I've gotten, part of what the lessons that are coming out of it is like Nancy Pelosi is not some sort of, conservative centrist type figure. And yet she's also a machine, knows how to do politics, transactional, keeps track of who owes favors and the like, which is something that we've, I think a lot of people appreciate about Pelosi. But a lot of critics then see just that latter part and say, oh, then she's part of the establishment, because she is, but she's not like, deeply to the right of a lot of progressives on a lot of issues, at least especially on like where she would like to be in her sort of maybe in her heart. And you can see that in a lot of the early stuff that she does on AIDS and gay rights and so forth that actually cost her some things. But the point being that the factions are more complicated than just the way we often think about them. And you start to tap into a little bit of that. So I'm curious where we think those factions may matter sort of down the road. And I'm going to stop there because otherwise we're going to have no time for further discussion. But those are some thoughts that this raised for me.
Thank you, Hans. And just for our listeners and watchers, we have a little more time. We don't have to stop right at the hour. So if you're interested, we welcome you to hang on with us as the conversation continues. But we also understand that people have obligations. Seth, would you like to respond? Would you like to hear from the chat? Tell me how you'd like to proceed.
I'll just touch briefly on some of Hans's questions. I won't get to all of them. Hans Noel and I, by the way, we've been known each other. We've been colleagues since 1997, first day of graduate school at UCLA. We both realized we shared a love of American politics and Star Wars and the politics of Star Wars. We're also finishing up a textbook together on political parties, should be available next year. I was really interested in your first question there about like, would it help party actors, party activists to actually know the right answer about why an election came out as it did, if we could divine one. And I guess it sort of depends what that might be. My sense in this is, I guess the usual political science answer about like why an election comes out as it did is that, well, you've got the fundamentals, you got the economy and a few other things that explain most of what's going to happen. And then you have some random variation there at the end. It was going to be a close election and Trump wins on a coin toss, basically. And that's not a very helpful analysis, even if that's the right one, right? You don't know what to do with that information. A party gets sort of no marching orders. How do we make things better or worse for ourselves next time around? So, I think, maybe in some ways the truth just is really not satisfactory. You need an argument. There's that one other, you had a question in there about just thinking about the lesson for Republicans. There's a quote, I think I have it in the book, in one of the DNC meetings about how to think about the party. There was a supporter of Bernie Sanders who said, the wisest minds in the Democratic Party in 2016 got together and came up with Hillary Clinton, someone who couldn't win. And the random rabble in the Republican Party came up with someone who could. And so they were sort of wrestling with the idea about how much party control was actually a good thing or a bad thing at the time. I want to think more about that factional question, because that's really interesting, but I actually don't have a great answer now. And I want to leave some time for our many patient audience members here.
Thank you. This is great. This is wonderful. There's so many strands to follow. But there's a question that came in from Lisa Conant, who chairs the political science department, a dear colleague of ours. And I'll just read it for you. Sorry, that's to me. I wonder about the extent to which we can draw firm conclusions about whether a woman can win the presidency just because women did well in legislative races for Congress in 2018. As poorly represented as women still are in Congress, from a comparative perspective, women have much worse representation in executive offices such as governors, mayors, compared to their representation in legislative venues at various levels within the US. And this can be open to any of you on our panel. But that's a really interesting question about what lessons we draw from different branches.
That's interesting. Okay, I'll jump in on this briefly. This is my department chair, and annual reviews are coming up shortly, so I should say something nice here. But so my impression, and again, to go back to what I just said previously about sort of like the fundamentals of elections, to the extent those still tell us what happens in presidential elections, Hillary Clinton actually slightly outperformed the fundamentals in 2016. As if we just took generic candidates, generic Democrat versus generic Republican, and say, here's what the economy is, here's what the international situation is, you would have come up with the Democrat doing slightly worse than Hillary Clinton did. Now, people had, if you ask voters, like, what do you think about Hillary Clinton? They will come up with all sorts of gendered things to say about her. And the way she's covered in the media, there's a lot of sexism that comes out there and in comments. But in terms of people's actual voting behavior, I think we actually have a hard time finding a real penalty against her there. I might be wrong on that. There's others who study this far more closely than I do. But my impression is, yeah, sorry, go ahead. Who was jumping in there? Oh, Jonathan, were you about to say something?
Yeah, well, I've got something that sort of ties in very much with your book, which is that if you talk to Democratic, I suspect if you did this study among state party people and national party people in the 1970s and 80s, and even well into the 90s, you would find a huge aversion to nominating women and nominating Black candidates and nominating any non-white candidate for statewide offices. And it's true that there's still a bit of a difference between executive versus legislative. But if you look at Senate candidates, if you look at House candidates, 10 years ago, it was sort of, there was a strong effort to keep from nominating Black candidates in white majority districts. That's not nearly true anymore. It may not be true at all anymore. I haven't looked at the actual data on it, but we have, all these in the last couple cycles, Democrats are nominating Black candidates. They're nominating women statewide. So we have, and all these women who are senators, and that's going to eventually, whatever the party hesitations are, it's going to push them because that's going to be the logical candidates. And you saw that very much this time, even though they didn't win. That if you look at who the logical candidates are, there's going to be women, and there's going to be Black candidates because there's going to be senators and governors from those demographic groups.
I'd like to jump in on this too. And as someone who's thought a lot about this, although it's more of a question than a comment, I guess, but I think it does bear thinking a lot more about women's role specifically in the Democratic Party. In a lot of the state Democratic parties I've covered, they're still run by like 90-year-old women who first got into activism with the ERA, right? And to the extent that a lot of the reason women are underrepresented is because parties do not select them to put forward, right? Because when women are the nominee, they do as well as men, as you point out in the book, but they tend not to be selected either by the male-dominated party establishment, the machine politics that still prevails in some states, or the so-called pipeline problem that has been so much discussed of women not coming in on the lower rungs of elected office, and that pipeline problem has really seen a sea change since 2016 in particular, and I write about this in my book. Thank you, Hans, for the endorsement. Tell me where to send the check. But this is that there was a real reluctance of women to see political power and elected office as the venue for their basically public service until Donald Trump won. And then overnight you saw an absolute order of magnitude shift. And you reference also in the book some of the really good research that's been done on the lack of a sort of feminist identity politics historically in this country, that women have not necessarily seen voting for women as something that they feel emotionally compelled to do, and I do wonder whether that will change along with this other shift in women's participation.
Thank you both. I've got a tough one here, and I have gone back and forth about whether to ask it. but I also want to acknowledge that we have some of our best history and political science students on this call. So this one comes to from Colin Phipps, one of Seth's most accomplished former students who recently graduated. And Colin is asking the tough one, and that is, what's our takeaway if the Democratic Party loses? In other words, Seth, you've written the first draft of history, but I wonder if you or any of the other panelists have a sense of, based on this kind of research and where your discipline is, what might that look like in terms of how we understand the future of the party?
Yeah, I should say Colin actually helped with this book. He did some of the research collection on it. He's in the acknowledgments. Thanks, Colin. That's a tough question. So what if Democrats lose? I think it matters a lot. Usually we have a hard time coming up with narratives because it's a very murky process. If Democrats lose, there's going to be some very specific ways in which they lose this year, right? It could mean that, imagine Joe Biden wins the popular vote by 3 or 4 points and still loses the Electoral College. That's possible. And I don't know if Democrats come out of that saying, well, we need to move further to the right. We need to keep doing the things we've been doing, and we need to find someone even more electable, or if they just say, wow, this system is just not working for us. Which is in some ways, it's like a scarier conclusion to reach, but it's sort of, we don't know how to win with the rules stacked the way that they are, where we have to constantly moderate and the Republicans don't. If they were to lose both the popular vote and the electoral vote, then one of the books that I relied on heavily for this was Phil Klinkner's book, The Losing Parties, where he basically looks at every party that lost the presidency from the 1950s to the 1990s, and sort of looked at what the conversation there among the party leaders was about what they had to do. And there was a point, I think, at after the Democrats lost in 1988, after basically 3 consecutive White House losses, and where they felt that they had done the things that they needed to do to win, and they still got trounced. And there was a certain where they just like threw their hands up and said, screw it, we have no idea. We don't know why we're losing. And eventually they came around to just saying, okay, we're going to moderate further. We're going to come up with, a Southern governor, and came up with Bill Clinton for that. I don't know what the Bill Clinton equivalent would be for Democrats into 2024. I think they already feel they've moderated quite a bit to nominate Joe Biden. But that would be a very, I think a very heavy cycle for them, and not really sure exactly what to think going through that. I'd be curious if others had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I want to jump in and actually steal Hans's point about the rabble, because to me there's a very clear interpretation of that, and it's not one that's particularly linked with the Electoral College or with anything about the actual facts of the election results. Narratives often aren't. I wrote a book about that. But I think instead the obvious conclusion to draw, the line to draw between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden is the establishment one. And to me, the narrative would probably become Democrats need to nominate outsiders, and they need to nominate populists, and they need to nominate people who can make these kinds of claims that the Trump campaign can. And I really don't know that any of that would be connected to the reasons why that loss would come about, although maybe. But that's, I think, the sort of obvious. There are people at the ready, I think, to push that narrative is really one of the critical variables.
Thank you, Julia. And we have a question that's sort of the reverse from sophomore political science major Riley Judd. And I'll put this to the whole panel, but especially Seth, I think this is on your brain. Do you think the Republican Party will reshape and rebrand itself if Trump loses? If so, what do you think this change will look like, and how will it reshape 2024?
That's another great question. So, should the Republicans lose, I'm considering whether I want to go through this research process again and try and figure out what process they're going through. I think it would be a very different one. So I wrote a piece, I think, for the LA Times a month or two ago about how, my impression is that if Donald Trump loses this fall, he is also the front runner for 2024. That is, he's not going anywhere. He still wants to be president, and he would be claiming that that there was fraud. He got screwed out of the presidency, and it's not clear to me who in the Republican Party would push back on that narrative, who would challenge him and saying we need to sort of rescue our party from Trumpism. That the party seems very invested in that right now. So I don't think they're quite ready to have this soul-searching moment. There's a question sort of like how long it takes a party to change its views. Like it used to be thought that, a party needed to lose several times in a row before it was willing to moderate and change the sort of people it nominates. I make the argument in this book that Democrats actually did that fairly quickly after 2016, in part just because of the partisan nature of the times, and because of just how Trump governs and just his very aggressive style of governing, that Democrats found, another 4 years of Trump simply intolerable, relative to their other options. And I don't know if Republicans would go through that rapidly too, but my impression is probably not. I think they're still very much in Trump's thrall.
Anyone else on the panel want to jump in there about the future of the Republican Party if we have a certain outcome in November?
I want to add a little bit to what Seth just said there. So I've got a research project that I think is relevant here, where we asked activists during 2016. We asked activists, we gave them pairs of senators and said who's more liberal or more conservative. It's for a different project about measurement, but we asked them this, and one of the interesting patterns that emerged out of this is that senators that we would all agree, I think, are sort of well attached to Trump, and we think of as sort of pro-Trump senators, were identified by our respondents as more conservative than their, say, roll call record might suggest. And meanwhile, some senators who are clearly conservative based on the roll call record, so Ben Sasse, Jeff Flake, are viewed by our respondents as far less conservative. They're about essentially in the middle of the Republican Party. And so we interpret this as saying that, well, for our activists, and these were not just ordinary, it's activists in a survey, so there's a range of how active they are. They're not as active as the activists that Seth interviews, but there's still people who have identified as being engaged enough in politics to actually know who these people are. Their view of what it means to be conservative was heavily influenced in the aggregate by Trump, right? Even though I think when you talk to especially academics about whether Trump is a true conservative or not, they of course would say no, he's not. And then many active conservatives, people in the Lincoln Project, for instance, would also agree with that. So I think what Trump has done is he's really reshaped the Republican Party in some interesting ways, where he's brought over his stamp, whatever that might be, that is now the direction. And people in the party who have been working mostly to sort of satisfy him have been buying into that kind of argument. And so you've got people who are on the rise in the Republican Party, are people like Tom Cotton, who are more consistent with a Trumpian perspective, and people who are who might have been thought to be on the rise before are like Ben Sasse, are not, because they are not on the Trump side. So now supposing Trump is gone completely, and Seth suggests that he might even stick around and be active in the party, but suppose he just gives up and says, okay, fine, I'm done, and leaves, there's still a lot of people who are now empowered in the party who are Trumpian in their direction of how they think about what it means to be Republican and what it means to be conservative. There are also a lot of people in the Republican Party who I think would be happy to revert to a pre-Trump vision of conservatism and would like to do that too. And I think that tension would play out in the same way that the tension is playing out in the Democratic Party over slightly different visions. And it's not obvious who wins, given the way that the primary process works, that it favors the sort of really passionate type people who did also vote for Trump. It's just quite possible that the next presidential nominee would be more on the Trump line than in the Lincoln Project line. And then two presidents that are like that, or two presidential candidates back to back that are like that, really are going to put a stamp on the party. So I think if Trump both loses and steps aside, there's going to be a battle within the Republican Party. And I'm not taking the odds on who wins, but I don't think it's obvious that everything reverts back to a pre-Trump period.
Can I jump in on this? I think without being glib, I actually think that this book provides the key to answer that question, which is that which version of the Republican Party prevails is going to depend entirely on what narrative is crafted to explain why Trump lost, right? So if you have Fox News and the Mitch McConnell and the Chamber of Commerce all collectively telling Republican partisans that Trump lost because he was not a traditional conservative, or because of the various, repellent aspects of his personality or whatever else, if he is branded as a loser and as an individual in particular, that will, I think a lot of the, partisans who revere him primarily because he is a winner, do they then turn their back on him, right, and decide that a different vision is needed? So I wouldn't put odds one way or the other either, but I do think that, like, whether the post-election narrative is that Trump lost because he is Trump and therefore Trump is the wrong path for the party, or it's some other collection of factors, or the election was rigged, or some more Trumpian explanation for why he didn't actually lose even though he lost, that would lead much more to the party continuing in a Trump-like direction.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that also and underline what Molly said, especially about, what Fox News, what the conservative media winds up, how they interpret this. And there's a lot, it seems to me that there's a lot of, they can basically do what they want. And whether they find that Trump is still a product worth pushing, or whether they think, no, it's time to move on to something else, is going to be determined by, their profit motive. It's going to be determined by what individual talk show hosts happen to think. And I'm not sure, it's sort of a weird way to run a party, but I think that's very much what's going to happen. The other thing that I wanted to say is that there is a narrative which is going to kick in very quickly if Biden wins and Democrats have unified government. And it's very much in the keeping with again, Seth's book, that narratives matter. And there's a Republican narrative, which is Democrats win and we do these things and that destroys the Democrats. And the Republicans think of 1993 and 2009 as successes. And they are going to go back to that well, which means they're not going to compromise anything. They're going to do as much obstruction. They're going to try to mobilize people the way the Tea Party was. They're going, and similarly, find attacks similar to the ones that were used against Bill Clinton in 1993 and 94. And I think that they think of that as a win, even though they wound up losing the presidential election, but they won the midterms, and that's what they're going to be focused on. And again, whether that's actually why they won the midterms or not, I think that's where, in 1994 and 2010, I think that's very much what's going to dominate Republican thinking, even as the presidential race and questions about Trump are also going on at the same time.
Jonathan, I think that's really apt. And there's a question that just came in just along this line of narrative. So I wonder if we can stick with this just for a minute. This is from Mark Herman. Did the Comey letter and the media focus on the email server story come up in your interviews? And what is Biden's takeaway from the perception that 2016 was a Democratic loss because they brought a knife to a gunfight?
So, hey, Mark, good question. So there were a few people. It was certainly not a dominant narrative, but there were a few people who brought up, what I call these kind of exogenous things, that there were things that the campaigns really couldn't account for that just sort of turned the event at the last minute. And one of them was the Comey letter. There are also things like Russian interference. And so, there were a few of the activists I spoke to who clung to that and basically said, this was a winnable election if not for that one random little thing that no one could have seen coming. And which means, to go from there, it means we really don't have to necessarily rethink what we're doing. We're probably doing this right. Hillary Clinton was probably a good nominee if that hadn't happened. And therefore, we can continue to nominate someone like her again. We just, have to watch out for, rogue FBI agents or Russian interference or things like that. But that's not really something a party does. So, that, I think, to the extent that narrative came up, that was done in a way to sort of exonerate Hillary Clinton. I think in some ways, folks were just talking about some of the narratives that would emerge this year from a Republican loss. I think Republicans would, you know, there'd be some narrative that Trump was going to win if not for a pandemic, and who saw that coming? And that would be a way of kind of exonerating him, saying, look, the economy was strong. Now, if you look at the polling, no, he actually wasn't about to win. He was already trailing Biden by several points. But you know, the pandemic and the economic collapse made it harder. And so I think that would be sort of a way to exonerate him, and would, you know, probably help him if he were interested in the nomination again in 24.
Thank you, Seth. By way of wrapping up, I'm going to take a question from our brand new Center on American Politics postdoc, Chris Salaya. Seth, were there any novel methodological lessons that you learned from the process of creating this book? And I know the historians on this call are interested, right? We think of something like this really, aside from news coverage, this is really the first draft of history. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. This is a different kind of book for you in some ways?
It's an interesting question, Chris. So I'm not sure how novel it was. I mean, in many ways, like, you know, a lot of this, certainly not all of the book is interviews. You know, there's some campaign finance analysis in there, and there's some voting analysis, but to the extent I'm doing interviews, you know, I'm falling back on the work of people like Dick Fenno and others, who just, you know, were really good at digging into to the subjects that they study and trying to understand the world through their eyes. And I think that is that's a tradition that's still done, but it's fallen somewhat out of favor, I think wrongly. So, you know, I'm happy to continue with that. But it does make me think how, particularly when trying to focus on activists, which is such a vague term, and I use it very vaguely in this book, how much of that story is dependent on the path through which we find these people in the first place. So, you know, my approach was generally to, you know, when I was started with a given state, I would generally contact some of the political reporters who had focused on those in previous elections. And it's easy to find, you know, there's very good political reporters who focused for years on New Hampshire, who focused for years on Iowa, and just simply say, who do I need to talk to? Here's what I'm trying to understand. You know, who are the people who understand how these dynamics work? And they have a list of names, but those names will change somewhat from cycle to cycle. And that list of names is, I think, at least I found for coming out of 2016, it was somewhat more skewed toward the Hillary Clinton side of the party, simply because those people have a much longer history within the party and have done a lot of these things for longer. So it took more work to find like a representative group of Sanders people to get a sense of what they were doing. It was really easy to do this in Iowa and New Hampshire just because they've been doing it for so long and people were really open to talking. It was harder in South Carolina. It was harder in Nevada just because there's less of a history of it. And so I'm hoping I got it right, but someone else going at this in a similar way might come up with some different results just based on who was willing to talk to them, who answered the phone, and who they talked to in the first place. So, you know, I tried to be rigorous about that, but recognizing, you know, this was a really time-constrained project and there was only so much I could do.
That's great. And that leads me to the moment that all of you have been waiting for, or maybe just Seth. I know many of you have been long colleagues and friends of Seth, and we want to really acknowledge what Jonathan said is an enormous lift. The time constraints he was under, the sensitivity of this work, the relevance of this work, the stakes. So with whatever you have, and feel free to turn on your cameras if you'd like to congratulate Seth, but we really do want to acknowledge what a tremendous achievement this is. And we wish you well with the sales and the reception, and we couldn't be prouder of you. So congratulations to Seth, and please feel free to shout out if you want to.
Congrats.
Yay.
Congrats, Seth.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wait, where's the book cake?
Okay, that's a good question. So my daughter Sadie is actually working on it right now.
Okay.
She spared me the indignity of having to make my own book cake. So yeah.
There's no shame in that, Seth. All right, well with that, I want to especially thank our guests, Jonathan Bernstein, Molly Ball, Julia Azari, and Hans Noel. It's a great privilege to hear from you. We know how busy you are at this point of what is always a very, very busy career that you've carved out for yourself. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to those of you who've tuned in. We have kind of a rock star audience as well of political scientists whose work I've used across the country. It's great to see you on this call. And thanks especially to the Center on American Politics, Alicia McDowell, who organized this along with Aaron Dietrich, all our colleagues at the university, and Professor Seth Maskett.
And Susan.
Oh, and me,
you.
yeah.
Thank you, Susan.
All right, everyone. Enjoy your week. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.